Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, the fifth in our series, Climate Change, Action and Urgency. My name is Alna Dam, and I'm a dual trainee in intensive care medicine and anesthesia, and I'm also the co-chair of the Environmental Sustainability Work Group at the Intensive Care Society. It's my pleasure to introduce my co-chair for today's webinar, Dr. Jack Parry-Jones, who's a consultant in adult intensive critical care medicine in Cardiff, as well as the chair of careers, recruitment and workforce of the Faculty of Intensive Care Medicine. In today's session, we will continue to examine what we can do as individuals in our everyday lives to reduce the impact we have on the planet and limit our contribution to climate change at the pace and scale required. We'll be talking about money and how what we do with ours impacts the planet. We will be learning about investment, divestment, and offsetting, how it works and whether it's effective. Both our speakers today have pre-recorded their presentations, but will be available for live Q&A at the end of the session. At the bottom of your screen, you will notice a Q&A box. If you just put any questions directly into there, and we'll direct them to the correct presenters at the end of our session. So without further delay, it's my privilege to introduce to you our first speaker today, Professor Paul Ekins. He's a Professor of Resources and Environmental Policy at the University College London Institute for Sustainable Resources, where his work focuses on the conditions and policies for achieving an environmentally sustainable economy. Today, he's talking to us about money, including investment, divestment, and pensions.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I've been asked to talk about money, which is the normal word for finance. I'm not going to use any slides. I'm going to be personal about this. We all have money. Some of us have more than others, and how we spend that money amounts to a positive vote in the product. We're telling manufacturers we want more of that, and an endorsement of the environment, social and governance conditions under which the product is made. And we've heard a bit about those scope 3 type things. I'll come back to them in a minute. The standard economic conception is that we can do two things with our money. We can either spend it, and that means that we consume goods and services, or we can save it. We can invest it, which means we give it to someone else who will then use it to enable other people to produce other goods and services of various kinds. And so whatever we do with it, it's going to cause this economic activity that Hugh was talking about right at the beginning. And the question I want to address in the next 10 minutes is, from a zero carbon perspective, what should we spend our money on? What should we invest it in? What should we demand that others should invest in if they're using our money? What should we demand that governments should spend on when they're spending our taxes, which is also our money, because obviously the government gets quite a lot of our earnings before we even see it. We've had a lot of discussion about elements of consumption today, and I'm very glad that others have told you what scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 is, so I don't need to explain it. But in terms of consumption, scope 1 is simplest. Anything that uses fossil fuels is a problem. So every time we buy a car, it's a problem. Every time we buy an air ticket, it's a problem. Every time we change our boiler to have a gas boiler, it's a problem. And it's not only a problem when we use it, because obviously all those things use fossil fuels. It's a problem when we buy it, because they've all taken fossil fuels to use. So when I hear that the largest selling kind of motor car these days is an SUV, which weighs getting on for 2 tons compared to the average of 1 ton that it used to be 15 years ago, well, you know that that's 2 tons of stuff, and putting that 2 tons of stuff together has used a lot of fossil fuel. So that's scope 1, and those choices are more or less within our purview. We can all make those choices in a lower carbon way, and eventually will have to be a zero carbon way. Then there's the scope 2 stuff. When we buy electricity, well, that's very often made with fossil fuels. You saw globally it's 80% fossil fuels. In the UK, it's a bit less than that now, thank heaven. It's only about 50%. But actually, even that purchase decision is not easy. I remember when I was on the board of the National Consumer Council, which is a body that was long since abolished by the government. At that time, green tariffs were just coming in where people were buying renewable electricity. And it was a remarkable fact that 3 times as much renewable energy was being bought in the UK as was being generated. So clearly there was a lot of greenwashing going on, and a lot of consumers were being disappointed, and indeed they became very cynical and skeptical about the whole thing. And it's happening again. If you go onto the Uswitch site, you'll find that practically all the big consumers now offer green tariffs, but they are very different in kind as to precisely what they mean. And again, this is something that we have to hope is going to be sorted out, because this whole business of labeling and of consumers being able to know what they are getting is an enormously important thing. And obviously it implies even more when you're talking about scope 3, when you're actually thinking about how is this product made and how do I know? And these things are unbelievably complicated. Global supply chains are enormous. They're very lengthy. Things go backwards and forwards many times through the as they're being put together, especially relatively complex products. And it's really hard to know precisely what it is that what it is that you are endorsing when you buy something. Some things you know are very energy intensive and therefore very carbon intensive at the moment. So steel, cement, chemicals, farming, bulk chemicals particularly, rather more than the pharmaceuticals that Jason was talking about earlier, though they are too. And some bioproducts, and not all bioproducts are the same. We've talked about beef quite a bit, for example, but actually there are many different kinds of beef. And the carbon footprint of a cow that is grazed on grass in the UK is very different from the carbon footprint of a cow that is fed soya in the UK, especially if that soya comes from Brazil, grown on land that last year was tropical rainforest. So these things are very difficult. At the moment, consumers find it as good as impossible. Back in 1989, I set up an organization called New Consumer in order to try to help consumers with this. It didn't last that long because by the time we did the research, we published some fabulous books, but their implication was that a consumer would need a PhD in consumer studies before they went shopping. And obviously not many consumers were prepared to make that level of commitment. And we haven't come very much further with helping consumers to make the kinds of choices that they need to make. So on to investment. So those of us who are lucky enough not to consume all the income that we're given, what should we be doing with that surplus money? Well, the first thing we'll do is put it into a bank account. And of course, not all the banks are equal in this respect. So most of the banks will take that money and they will invest in stuff which from a zero carbon perspective is disastrous. Most of them still invest in new coal-fired power stations around the world. And it may surprise you to know that many countries are still building new coal-fired power stations. And even the UK is still considering opening a new coal mine in Cumbria, which is something which I've been pleased to be campaigning against for the last 6 to 9 months. So what the bank is doing is important. Then there are our own personal investments. We may have a personal pension fund, for example, and we may think, well, what's going on with that? And we probably need a financial advisor to help us. And the good news is that there are financial advisors who specialize in ethical investments. I actually use one called Ethical Investors, which I found very satisfactory for the last 20 years or so. Or we may want to get involved in direct funding ourselves. And the other bank I would mention in this context is the Triodos Bank. They have crowdfunding schemes where you can actually support good local organizations. It's risky. You may lose your money, but you get paid a higher interest rate on those projects than sticking it in a building society. And again, if you're looking for low risk, then the Ecology Building Society is a splendid organization. I was happy to, at one point, to have the number F1 because I was the first person who invested in it back in 1980. And it's been extremely successful, and it uses its money for very worthwhile things, mainly refurbishments of buildings and energy efficiency, but also other kinds of businesses. Then you may have a company pension, which you contribute to. And of course, that's a bit difficult because not everyone shares my values, your values, we're all different. And there are some pensioners who simply want to get the highest possible financial return. And obviously, pension companies have trustees that want to be sustainable. They have commitments to pay pensions. And it's a difficult investment environment at the moment. There is fiduciary duty, which is open to a wide range of interpretations, such that some pension trustees think that it gives them quite a lot of freedom to take account of non-financial values, but other pension trustees think it doesn't. So that's a bit of a grey area still. Again, my own personal experience, I'm an academic at University College London, and therefore I contribute to the University Superannuation Scheme, USS, one of the largest pension schemes in the country. And it's been a long campaign with USS, trying to persuade them to take account of these environmental considerations. They're better than they were, but they're still by no means perfect. But from the trustees' point of view, they say they're looking at a pension gap of 38 billion. And there's currently going to be quite a lot of trouble in the university sector as they try to persuade both universities and university employees to pay in a lot more into those pension schemes. The good news on all these positive investments, and this is a very broad brush statement, is that the academic literature suggests that they do no worse, and very often they do better than the run-of-the-mill investments that you may wish to make. It's on that basis that through ethical investors, certainly all the spare cash that I have, not that it's very great, is put into these kinds of funds, which are now very, very common, run by all the big asset managers. And so there's really very little risk involved in doing that, which of course is one of the arguments for asking people like USS to put far greater proportions of their reserves and resources into those sorts of things. Before I finish, just a couple more points. Other major investors obviously are insurance companies, and it's really interesting because insurance companies have been very concerned about these issues for a long time, about climate change in particular. It's in their interest to be, obviously, because the extreme weather events that Hugh was talking about at the beginning stand to be a very great liability for insurance companies. But I don't use insurance companies very much because I kind of don't have a car, and my house is insured through the local authority that I have it from. But I've never seen an insurance company offer anything on the basis of the balance between the size of the premium and the cover that it was offering. I've never seen an insurance company try to sell a premium on the basis of that, on the basis of what it's going to invest your money in. So it seems to me that that is a kind of interesting innovation that might come up, and it may be that someone is going to tell me that I've missed something, and that would be great. And then there's the issue of divestment, which Fintan mentioned right at the beginning of this conference. It's the equivalent of a boycott in goods and services, and those of us who are as old as I am will remember the anti-apartheid campaign, when we were very much encouraged both to boycott the financial sector, but also to boycott the goods sector. in order to show our disapproval of apartheid. And there were some who thought that that was quite effective. And of course, there's a quite controversial campaign of boycotting at the moment on goods and services from settlements in Israel that have been established on Palestinian land. But even divestment is not at all simple. And I was a bit involved in UCL's divestment campaign, and I'm proud to say that UCL has now disinvested entirely from fossil fuels. But if you look through the disinvestment literature, you've got fossil-free disinvestment, where you don't have any investments in fossil fuels at all. You have full disinvestments, which is saying that you are going to be fossil-free from a certain date. There's partial disinvestment, where you choose that you will disinvest from some fossil fuel companies, but not others. There's coal and tar sands, which is people who say they will invest in fossil fuels, but not coal and tar sands. And then there's coal-only disinvestment. So you see that even a word as supposedly simple as disinvestment can get interpreted in lots of different ways. One of the things I didn't say at the beginning is that I lead the economics and finance group on the Lancet Countdown, which Hugh was one of the founders of some years ago. And disinvestment is one of our key indicators that we publish every year. And 14 trillion US dollars has so far been disinvested in one of those categories over the last 15 or 20 years, I guess, which is how long this campaign has been going for. 14 trillion sounds a lot of money, but obviously it's rather a small proportion, less than 10% of the proportion of the actual assets in circulation, so that the that movement has quite a long way to go before it gets there. And when you ask your pension company to disinvest, or you suggest that someone else should disinvest, the argument that is often put, which is not a wholly worthless argument, is that it might actually be better for shareholders to continue to engage with companies and try to persuade them to change their ways. I used to think that that was a good argument, but I've become a bit more impatient than that now. And so I'm a right-on disinvestor. But there we go.
So we're going to go over to Tim Ryder now, who's the Forestry and Climate Advisor at the Wildlife Conservation Society, which of course is partnered with the Trillion Trees programme. He's responsible for developing new projects on forest protection and forest restoration, and specialises in sustainable landscape approaches to delivering natural climate solution. He's going to speak to us about offsetting and particularly nature-based solutions. So over to you, Tim. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Tim Rayden. I'm the Forestry and Climate Advisor at WCS, the Wildlife Conservation Society, and a partner in the Trillion Trees programme with WWF and BirdLife International. I'm going to talk to you about offsetting and what constitutes responsible offsetting, responsible use of offsets, with a focus on nature-based climate solution and forestry and trees in that context. So let me just share with you my screen and let's get cracking. Okay, so quick overview of what I want to talk about, the role of offsets in getting to zero, what nature-based solutions are, the role of forests under that heading, and the two types of forest-based offsetting options that are available, reducing deforestation and regrowing forests. I'm going to touch a word at the end on alternative solutions to carbon capture, direct air capture, before concluding. So this is the context that we're in. Paris Agreement commitments to try and restrict global temperature rise to within 1.5 degrees in order to avoid those catastrophic consequences for human health and well-being and for our environment. But that implies drastic and rapid emissions cuts, 45% emissions reductions needed by 2030, according to the IPCC. And given the magnitude of those cuts, most of those projections acknowledge that there will need to be some plan for CO2 removals for those hard to abate emissions, things that can't be avoided in the short term. And so there is a lot of research and development ongoing in the area of negative emissions technologies, like trees, for example, ways to avoid emissions or capture emissions from the air or at source. And nature-based solutions is one category of negative emissions technologies, ways of keeping, using nature to maintain carbon stocks, avoid the emission of carbon from land or ocean-based carbon stocks, and to increase drawdown of carbon into those land or sea stocks. Why are nature-based solutions important? Well, forests are a huge asset already in the fight against climate change. Intact forests absorb about 30% of our current anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. But the process of deforestation, the process of land use change, means we're running down the natural world's ability to buffer our emissions. Forest deforestation causes emissions, but also reduces the land sink's ability to absorb those emissions that we are still pushing out into the atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels. So nature-based solutions, the debate around nature-based solutions is predominantly about what we can do to the land base and to our forest resources. Stopping deforestation prevents emissions right now, so that's a good thing. Restoring forests builds back the land base's ability to hold carbon, to sequester carbon. I should also note that there are other forms of nature-based solutions, including enhancing agricultural land's ability to store carbon through the use of biochar or enhanced weathering, and also measures to increase the ocean sink's ability to take in carbon dioxide through changing the ocean's acidity. But those are not areas that I'm going to focus on today. So how do you turn a climate solution into an offset? Well, an offset is essentially the compensation for emissions in one place by reducing or avoiding emissions somewhere else. A carbon credit, what's known as a verified carbon unit, VCU, is 1 ton of carbon dioxide. So 1 ton of carbon dioxide reduced or avoided can be turned into a marketable commodity and sold to somebody who needs it, who can't reduce or avoid their own emissions. So the trade in VCUs allows businesses and individuals a chance to quantify their footprint and then engage in a measurable emissions neutralization approach. In terms of the world of nature-based solutions and forests, forest-based offsets really fall into 2 categories, as I mentioned. The first is preventing emissions from deforestation, avoided emissions from deforestation. And the second is removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by growing new trees, or afforestation and reforestation. I'm going to look at each of those in turn. So the first one is reducing emissions from deforestation. You may have heard the acronym RED or REDD, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. And this is essentially the prevention of deforestation to avoid the emissions of those tons of carbon dioxide that are related to that land use change. This is the most developed area of nature-based solutions. The longest standing projects are in this area. This is a way of delivering immediate impact to the climate. I already said that deforestation is one of the major components of our anthropogenic carbon emissions. So it's logical that stopping deforestation is going to have an immediate and beneficial climate effect. But actually turning that into a measurable number of offsets is quite complicated, because it depends on the construction of a credible baseline of what would happen under business as usual. I've tried to illustrate that here, where you have a historic forest area which is being reduced by deforestation, and so you have a historic baseline of reduced carbon stocks and carbon emissions. If you allow that baseline to continue into the future, it's logical that those carbon stocks will be further reduced. But if you can stop that deforestation from occurring, then you should be able to claim the credit for those avoided emissions. And it's those CO2 emissions avoided which can become carbon credits under a reduced emissions from deforestation scenario. That process of projecting a future scenario is fraught with difficulty and is quite nuanced, and there's lots of debate around how to do that. But it does require quite sophisticated land use change modeling, for example. But it is, as far as the bigger picture is concerned, clearly preventing deforestation has a beneficial effect on the climate. So within certain parameters, it's possible to model that, to model the reduced emissions effect, and subject to certain caveats, those are real emissions reductions which can be credited and traded. Worth mentioning that that within the Trillion Trees partners, we have some examples of these kind of projects. The Gola Rainforest project in Sierra Leone, which has been developed by BirdLife International and RSPB, the Kiosema Wildlife Sanctuary in Cambodia, which is a WCS project, and the Makira project in Madagascar, also developed by WCS. These are quite long-running projects now, and you should notice that the amount of emissions that have been avoided by the protection of these forest areas are really quite large in the context of measures to help the climate. So these are important projects which have now been delivering benefits for several years. So the second part is afforestation and reforestation projects, essentially planting new trees that soak up carbon dioxide as they grow and store it as biomass. Now, everyone likes to plant a tree. The advantage of afforestation is it's much easier to measure than avoided deforestation. There were no trees there before, now there are trees. That's something that's quite easy to quantify. However, planting trees does take time and money. Trees grow quite slowly, so the amount of carbon that's sequestered by those trees is quite small at first and only builds up over a period of years. And those projects, of course, have to be financed over the long term to ensure that those carbon gains are permanent, that the trees are still standing. So that makes afforestation and reforestation projects slightly more expensive than avoided deforestation projects. But obviously, because of the ease of measurement and the guarantee, the relative guarantee of certainty of those removals, they tend to be preferred by many people. Now, zooming back a touch from those specific types of projects, are we really sure that this is legitimate? Are offsets not just greenwashing? Well, actually, the answer to that is partly related to the consumer of offsets, the user of offsets, and partly related to the way the projects are built. The first principle should always be that offsets are only used as a last resort once the consumer, if that's an individual or a company, has done everything they can to reduce their own emissions, their own direct emissions. Offsets should only be really used to compensate those hard to abate emissions, like essential travel or essential resource or material use that simply can't be switched out for low carbon alternatives. But then the second part of it is to ensure that the offsets are generated credibly and verified to international standards, that the projects generating those offsets have been verified through a credible process, such as the Verified Carbon Standard run by Verra. And there are three critical components, that certification process, when it comes to nature-based solutions, forestry projects like the ones I've mentioned. The first is that you're able to demonstrate additionality. The reduction or removal would not have happened unless the project was able to finance those measures. So in other words, in the avoided deforestation scenario, an area of forest was fairly certain to be deforested unless this project was able to intervene with resources and capacity to prevent that from happening. You must be able to demonstrate your additionality in that sense. Second point is that you must avoid what's referred to as leakage. This is the displacement of deforestation activities or emissions generating activities somewhere else. It's okay to prevent deforestation here, but if all that happens is that those deforestation actors, the humans that were causing that deforestation, move to the neighboring district and clear forest over there, the net result of that, as far as the climate is concerned, has been zero. So you need to have measures in place to avoid leakage. And in practical terms, that means working with the local landowners to find new models of land use, more sustainable agricultural models that don't require constant expansion. And the final point is about permanence. Carbon verification processes require that a degree that permanence is achieved for at least 30 years. Now, as I mentioned, with afforestation projects, you need to, it's not just a question of planting the trees, but you need to make sure those trees will survive and grow and be around in 30 years' time to demonstrate that requirement. That's so it's not a small affair. Similarly, for ensuring forest protection, you need to be able to finance that forest protection for that period to demonstrate permanence. And if there are any question marks around permanence, then the project is obliged to take some of the carbon credits generated and place them in a buffer pool, in a sort of insurance policy. That means if some reversals occur, if there are accidentally some emissions that were unforeseen, for example, forest fires or a land grabbing event that wasn't prevented, then those lost credits can be taken out of that insurance policy, out of that non-permanence buffer, so that the system as a whole is always net on the right side of the line in terms of emissions reduced. So the final point was just to compare these nature-based solutions with some of the alternatives that are starting to emerge in the market, and particularly measures for direct air capture. This is a picture of a prototype mechanical tree for the capturing of carbon dioxide directly from the air. There have been subsequent iterations of this machine that are somewhat more elegant, that are now starting to be deployed. Most of these direct air capture processes require the use of a chemical reaction to adsorb carbon dioxide onto a solid material, and then through heating that material to regenerate to drive off the carbon dioxide and capture it in a pure form, and then regenerate the material for reuse. All of the direct air capture processes that are currently under development require a large amount of energy for that process. The most efficient has to heat the material to about 100 degrees in order to regenerate the carbon capturing substances, the boiling point of water, which is the majority of the energy use requirement. So one of these facilities actually requires the equivalent energy of a small power station to run, and that's not a trivial point, because while that energy could be supplied from renewable sources, the current economics of emissions reductions means that it would be more efficient to use that renewable energy to substitute for fossil fuels in the general market rather than use it for direct air capture. So these projects tend to be quite expensive in energy terms, also quite expensive in cost terms. The projected at scale costs of these solutions are still around 10 times the cost of nature-based solutions. What they do have on the plus side of the line is being able to offer a high degree of permanence. Once the carbon dioxide is captured in a pure form, it can be mineralized, it can be turned into rock and placed in geological storage. And assuming there are enough places to store that material, it is taken out of the system for a very, very long period of time. So while they don't really measure up to nature-based solutions in terms of cost or energy use, they can offer a high degree of permanence. And they are certainly a big part of the solution post 2030, as the costs of deploying these kind of technologies start to come down. But I think the final point I want to make in favor of nature-based solutions and forest-based offsets is that these aren't just climate solutions. If you are investing in one of these projects to protect forests or to restore forests, then these are measures that don't just deliver climate benefits. They're also delivering all the other benefits that forests provide, protecting watersheds, creating rainfall, accumulating soil, and providing landscapes with resilience to climate change, as well as habitats for most of the world's biodiversity. So forest-based solutions are good value in terms of the climate, but triple value in terms of the overall benefit that they can deliver for people, nature, and climate. And that's one of the reasons why we think it is important to support those kind of solutions. So thank you very much. I'll leave it there.
That's great, Tim. Thank you very much. And also thank you very much to Paul as well. So my name is Jack Parry-Jones. As I was kindly introduced by Eleanor, I'm a consultant in adult intensive care in Cardiff. I'm very grateful for the Intensive Care Society for their invitation to chair this meeting. So if you could, for those people, participants, if you could raise a hand and either raise your hand and then, well, I'll take your question for Tim or Paul, or if you cannot enter it into the Q&A box, then we can do it that way. So if I can start actually with Tim, a question for you, please. I'm interested in what your view is on an individual buying offsets. So if, for example, I decide to fly to Spain for a holiday, what's your view on us as individuals trying to offset that flight?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and thanks for the opportunity to participate in the session. It does go back to the point I made in the talk about doing everything you can to reduce or avoid your emissions before resorting to offsets. So I guess as an individual, you have to ask yourself whether that holiday in Spain is really necessary. Of course, there are alternatives. You can take the train, much lower carbon footprint. So you can reduce that footprint to a point while still maintaining the luxury of the holiday in Spain. But that does obviously cost a bit more. I would say offsetting without behavioral change doesn't get us very far. Although it is worth noting and encouraging that most people who engage in voluntary offsets do also take measures to reduce their footprints in other ways. So it's maybe a first step towards a longer term process of reducing and avoiding emissions.
Can I jump in on that, Jack?
Yes, please do, Paul.
Pleased to be able to join you, because this is an absolutely critical point, and it's one of the reasons why I've decided that actually offsets do much more damage than good. Simply because humans, an understanding of human behavior is that although Tim may say that humans must mitigate as far as they can before taking offsets, actually we don't. As humans, we don't think like that. And this was brought home so clearly to me at the time when Bill Gates was publishing his book on climate change. Bill Gates has a market, he has a voice. And someone asked him, here he is publishing this book on climate change, saying it's really a problem about this. Why was he still using his private plane? Private planes are something like 20 times more polluting than flying business class. And business class is about 4 times more polluting than flying economy class. And Bill Gates's answer was, well, I like private planes. I always do private planes. That's the kind of person I am. And I offset my emissions. And as soon as I heard that, coupled with this next story I'm going to tell you, I just realized that offsets actually give humans a way out of justifying to themselves that they don't change, and no amount of people like me and Tim saying that offsets are a last resort is going to work. And this next example was, I spent a long time in the summer preparing, giving evidence to the public inquiry on the proposals for a new coal mine in Cumbria, which in my view are, absolutely appalling in 2021, when we're trying to wean the world off coal. And we're seeing some really encouraging new technologies coming through of zero carbon steel, which is what this coal was going to be used for. And there I was arguing in this public inquiry, and I was getting responses through the lawyers, from the coal miners. This is going to be a net zero coal mine because we're going to offset all our emissions. They hadn't put any numbers in their financial statements about how much these offsets were going to cost. They hadn't given any thought to the topic at all. They were just saying, oh yeah, this is get out of jail free card. We're going to say we're going to offset stuff. And that, I'm afraid, is how people behave. So, the theory of the offsets are fine if people use them as a last resort, if they are additional, if there's no leakage, and if they're permanent. And I don't accept the definition of permanent that was in Tim's presentation of 30 years. Carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere hundreds of years. If Bill Gates puts however many tens of tons of CO2 into the atmosphere by using his private plane, that stuff is going to be in the atmosphere causing climate change for centuries. And if he's just buying a few trees that are going to last for 30 years, that in no sense of the word is that an offset. And I'm just really concerned about the way this is now being used. And of course, Tim wouldn't sanction this and wouldn't agree with it, but offset is now being used as this kind of get out of jail free card. And that says nothing about the desirability of planting trees, which is great. Nature-based solutions is great. Trillion trees needs to really go for it, but let's go for it on its own terms and not use it to justify high carbon behaviors.
No, thank you, Paul. That's very useful. I like to think of coal as carbon offsetting for the planet, which occurred, hundreds of thousands of years ago. That's really what coal is, and that's what oil is. So that's how we'd be better off seeing it as this was planet's way of offsetting carbon. My question for you, Paul, was about how you're a wise, experienced person, and I'm very interested to hear how you stop yourself being demoralized by mankind's behavior. And what do you think as an individual we might be able to do to stop ourselves being demoralized?
Well, I mean, in a way, I think being demoralized or not, one of the questions I get asked in public presentations all the time is, are you optimistic, about this stuff? Anyone looking at the science and anyone looking at the trajectory of carbon dioxide emissions can't possibly be optimistic. we've spent 30 years doing blah, 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 according to Greta Thunberg, and I can hardly disagree with that. If you look at the graph of the rise of anthropocentric concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere since 1990, there's not a blip. There is not a blip in that upward trajectory. Everything we've done since then hasn't had any impact at all on the rise of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. Now, that is clearly very concerning. Does it demoralize me? No, of course it doesn't, because we've made lots of progress in other areas. We've developed a whole heap of renewable technologies. In my view, 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees is probably for the birds. You know, we're not going to get there, but we might stop it at 3 rather than going to 4 or 5 or 6. And 3 is going to be bad. Clearly 3 is bad. Our children and their children aren't going to thank us for 3, but it's better than 6. And therefore, there's still an enormous amount to play for, even though we've started too late and we're still doing much too little. But to a large extent, I think this is kind of personal character. You know, I'm determined to make the difference that I can while I'm around. And because why else, you know, what else am I going to do? Am I going to sit in front of the television all day? I mean, you know, like, it seems to me that this is really worth doing. So, yeah. And
no, thank you.
You can sense that I'm not demoralized at all.
No, thank you very much. Well, I think it's a good lesson for us. I have a question also for Tim. So I'm very keen on planting, tree planting as an individual. I mean, the maximum as I understand it, the maximum offsetting, if you're trying to, with trees, you're talking about 60 to 80 years, depending on the species. So in which case, at some point, the timber, is there a point where it's better to use that timber and replant? And if, I don't mean for natural forests that are already there, I mean for reforestation. And I suppose that leads on to what are you planting? So, I mean, in the UK, we don't plant enough wood or trees to maintain our own, to look after our own requirements. Should we only be planting natural forest or broadleaf forest? So I'd be very interested in your views on that.
Yeah, thanks for the question, and that does give me an opportunity to pick up on the point about permanence, which Paul made as well. And I should perhaps clear up first of all that it's not that 30 years is a definition of permanence, but simply that in the certification process they require you to demonstrate how you're going to get to 30 years. Most of the projects are anticipating a much higher degree of permanence than that. And maybe picking up on the point that you're making about timber plantations and timber use, maybe look at the example of Kielder Forest in the UK. It's not a specific carbon project, but Kielder Forest, established in the 1920s, still going strong today. You know, that's turned a low carbon ecosystem into a high carbon ecosystem on a pretty permanent basis. But you're right that a lot of the tree planting that happens in the UK is for commercial timber, and that does the carbon accounting for a plantation cycle where you're planning to harvest the wood is different from reforesting an area of natural forest that you don't expect ever to touch again, because essentially if you're growing trees and then cutting them down, the carbon stocks on the land go back down to 0 each time you clear the trees. Now, in carbon accounting terms, the conservative thing to do is to assume that you go back to 0 and start again. The carbon standards allow you to account for the long-term average of that fluctuation, which is about a third of the maximum. But in a lot of cases where you're talking about taking that timber and putting it into long-term use in housing construction, for example, there is a significant portion of that carbon that is also turned into a long-term carbon sink. It's not a huge amount; it's only about 10%, I think, of the carbon in the original forest that ends up in that long-term carbon storage in that form. But it does add a bit to the equation. But yeah, in carbon terms, the best thing you can do is turn cleared land back to natural forest and then allow nature to take its course and not touch it again. But commercial timber plantations do have a role to play in carbon sequestration and providing low carbon building materials and reducing the footprint of the construction industry as well. So it's a bit of both.
I mean, once a tree's taken up its max, I mean, it's growing, it reaches its maximum carbon uptake. Is it better then to have younger trees coming through and take the older one out? That's, I mean, because the older trees don't take as much carbon, they're fully grown. They're not taking as much carbon up as a younger tree growing.
Yeah, that's true to a point. I think the best thing to do would be to leave those older trees that can still go on growing and then plant some new trees somewhere else.
Yeah, no, yeah. Sorry, a question then, which touches both of you, I think. To Paul, what's your view on investing in direct air capture? Is that something that we, as individuals, could do? And if so, how would we go about doing that?
That's a very interesting question, one that I haven't looked at. Let's guess. As Tim said, the direct air capture is still at a pretty early stage of development. Again, I'm pretty skeptical about its ability to scale to the extent that many of the models that show 1.5 and 2 degrees suggest is necessary. But obviously, technologies can surprise us and take off in ways that we weren't expecting. And offshore wind is a very good example of that. It's really the province at the moment of either venture capitalists, these people with deep pockets who try a whole lot of stuff that doesn't look as if it's got a lot of prospects, in the hope that one of them is really going to work. And let's be clear, if any of these air capture technologies were able to scale so that on a regular basis they were absorbing 1 million, 10 million tons of carbon from the atmosphere, they would be huge in return terms. So the potential gain, assuming they were rewarded for their carbon capture, and that's obviously another question. We don't currently routinely reward carbon capture. Tim will know that I mean, the offsetting is a voluntary way of doing that, and there are other ways of doing it, which I think were in Tim's presentation, the RED scheme at the United Nations. If you want to do it as an individual, I think you'd find it difficult because most of these companies are not yet registered on share markets. They're kind of family firms and stuff. Some of them might go through banks like Triodos. So anyone who is aware of the Triodos Bank will know that they pick up all sorts of possible investments and allow people to invest in them. A lot of them are social enterprises, some of them environmental enterprises, quite a lot of renewable energy enterprises. But direct air capture is still so risky that I don't think a platform like Triodos would offer them yet, because, you know, I mean, they obviously don't want people to lose their money, basically. And I think there is still quite a large possibility that people will lose their money by investing in some of these technologies, as indeed a lot of people lost money on solar photovoltaics and wind power back in the early days. You know, that's the way it works. So I think as a retail investor, you and me, Jack, I would be wary of that, and I would try to look for renewable energy or safer investments, or indeed the kinds of things that Tim's talking about. I think, you know, all that planting of trees is terrific. I just wouldn't want it to be done as an offset. We can't hear you because you're muted.
Beg your pardon. Tim, any further thoughts on that?
I think that's a pretty good assessment. I'm not sure I can afford it, frankly, as a consumer, to invest in direct air capture. So I would choose a cheaper route. But yeah, I mean, I think the models in terms of where it can potentially get to in terms of scale up quite optimistic. There are projections that show it could be a bigger part of the solution than nature-based solutions in the longer term. Nature-based solutions obviously are limited by the amount of land we have, and certainly when it comes to afforestation and reforestation, you quickly start running into land limitations when you're trying to plant 1 trillion trees, for example. So direct air capture does have some advantages there, but yeah, as a retail opportunity, I wouldn't choose it right now.
Why don't you have a little empirical test, Jack, and set it up on a crowdfunder? And obviously, I guess none of us three who are talking here have the resources themselves to set up a big new air capture. But I mean, if you could get 10,000 people chipping in £300 each or whatever it is, then you might be getting to scale. I suspect it would not be a successful crowdfunder at this stage, in a way that, for example, community energy schemes can be successful crowdfunders now, and they would not have been successful 10 or 20 years ago. So it may just be that we would be before our time.
No, I know some people who've done that in parts of Scotland when they're doing it, and I think Cumbria actually for hydroelectric power.
Indeed.
There's a question from the audience, so which actually leads on from the previous question. So, do large-scale geoengineering projects, e.g., studies looking at greening the Sahara and the like, have a realistic role to play? So, I suppose that's primarily for Tim, actually.
Yeah, I can't really comment on greening the Sahara specifically. I haven't looked at that, but I mean, one of the geoengineering light solutions might be the options of enhanced weathering, what they call mineralization, using minerals on agricultural soils to increase carbon sequestration in agricultural soils seems to be quite a promising solution, with obviously very large geographical potential application. There's quite a lot of work to do to figure out the exact soil and mineral combinations that work, but it does have significant scale potential and is a win-win in the sense you get increased carbon sequestration and increased crop productivity. So I think that's where I would look next.
Yeah, if I could just comment on the greening of the Sahara, I'm actually very positive about that, mainly because I know a guy who does it at a very, very large scale. So in your question, I might want to look up a man called Tony Rinaudo, Rinaudo, and he has a proven methodology which is expanding very fast, which I'm not going to try to explain here, probably because I get it wrong, but it's proving to be extremely successful. And I would therefore direct people to that, and have enabled forests come back in the Sahel, which is really where he's there. So it's not quite greening the Sahara, it's the desertifying region to the south of the Sahara in Africa, where he's managed to reestablish vegetation on a very large scale indeed. So yes, I mean, I think that does have options and is far to be preferred to most of the geoengineering projects that I've no problem with Tim's weathering, but all the crazy things about sticking zillions of tons of iron filings in the ocean and putting mirrors in the sky, and even worse, putting up lots of particles in the sky to deflect radiation, or sulfur dioxide particles and stuff. I mean, this is all insane and is doing stuff to the global ecosystem that we simply don't understand, and would be very dangerous.
Yeah, I think huge unintended consequences.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think, I don't know if, Eleanor, whether you have any further questions yourself or as...
No, thank you so much for the questions, they were brilliant. I guess my question is, and touching on some of what Paul said and Tim, so obviously we should only be offsetting emissions we absolutely must offset. So what about emissions recalls within healthcare? Obviously there is large scale to reduce these, and the NHS Green Plan has, very much given us a map of how to get there by 2045 across all three scopes, but there is a significant proportion of offsetting within that plan. So how should we be offsetting these carbon emissions, and should we maybe not try to get to a true zero in the first place. I guess some of those questions you've already answered, which would be nature-based solutions, but what would be the best way to achieve that as such a large organisation as the NHS?
Well, let me answer just very quickly, because I'm not across the sources of your emissions in the NHS and what the options are. But I think, if offsets are to be used at all, the best thing to think about, the best way to think about them is as a temporary solution while you figure out what to do with those other solutions. You can buy a bit of time that way, but you have to use that time, as Paul said earlier, to actually make the meaningful changes to the emissions footprints.
And my guess would be that most activities that we engage in most sectors of society, and like Tim, I'm not au fait absolutely on top of the NHS, but with most activities, there are numerous things you can do actually to reduce emissions here and now. In the 2030s, 2040s, late, getting towards 2050, yes, if we've done everything we possibly can to reduce stuff, then offsetting becomes a feasible problem, because the level of emissions is much smaller than it is now. But to start with, offsetting, I think, is bound to take the pressure off, given that humans are humans, bound to take the pressure off the institution, actually to do what it can do now and make those savings that it needs to make. And I would think that for the vast majority of institutions, including the one behind me, which is my university, UCL, we have a zero target for 2030 or 2035. So we're absolutely not considering offsetting at the moment. Now, obviously, if we get to 2035 and we've reduced by 92% emissions, and we're dead keen to hit our zero target, we might consider it. But by allowing us to have that option now, I absolutely know that the institution would say, oh, it's all right, guys, we can always offset this stuff, because that's how humans work, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And I think this is a critical care audience, and there are things that we can do. So, for example, when we write up intravenous paracetamol and not oral or rectal, we're producing 64 times more carbon when we give intravenous paracetamol, and it's of no additional therapeutic benefit. And so there are everyday things that we can do. That's just one example in intensive care. And the really big thing, I think, is new builds. We need a massive infrastructure change in the NHS over the next 20 to 30 years. Those new builds have got to reduce their carbon footprint, and there can be ways of producing renewable energy in new builds and stopping waste, which we've got to address.
Yeah, well, you could apply that to the construction industry as a whole, which is an absolute which is an absolute disgrace.
Well, I was a graduate at UCL. I think they really need some solar panels on that thing behind you.
I don't even know if they face south, but yeah.
So thank you so much, Paul and Tim, for being here for the Q&A session, and also for really thought-provoking talks, and thank you again to the Intensive Care Society for organising this. This was the fifth in the series. The next talk is on Tuesday, the 12th of October, when Nick Watts, who's the Chief Sustainability of NHS, and I presume that's NHS England, is going to be speaking, alongside James Dixon, who's a sustainability manager from Newcastle. So again, two very interesting talks, I'm absolutely sure. And then the last point really is that the Intensive Care Society has a wellbeing and has a sustainability group. So if you want to join, I suggest you go onto the Intensive Care Society website and look at how you might be able to take part as an individual in this project, and also take these things forward. So thank you very much again, all, and I hope to see you at the future meetings. Thank you.
Thanks. Cheerio.
Yeah.